We played a clip from the Ebony track a little bit earlier on. Certainly a much-loved Prime Minister, but one who has perhaps fallen through the cracks of history. In fact, the title of the book is We Need to Talk About Norman, and that's certainly what we're doing today. Author of the book, Denis Welch, joins me on the program. Kia ora, good morning. Thank you for your time today.
Good morning, Andrew. Glad to be here.
Now, Norman Kirk, of course, he was one of our prime ministers in the early 70s. He wasn't the prime minister for particularly long. He did and died in office. Is that why he's perhaps a bit of a forgotten gem in terms of our political history, Denis?
Could be. It's a bit like the John F. Kennedy syndrome, isn't it?
Yep.
When a popular leader is cut down and dies in office. Kirk wasn't assassinated, but it's certainly his death at the age of 51 after just barely 20 months in office.
Yeah.
It's completely unexpected. He'd had some health problems, but not so much that anyone thought he would die. And he went into hospital for a bit of a rest, died at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night. Some people heard the news late that evening, but most of the nation woke up the following morning, Sunday, September the 1st, 1974, disbelieving.
Yeah.
And in the course of my research for this book, I spoke to so many people who remembered where they were and how they felt when they heard the news.
And certainly that is the case within my memory as well. For you personally, Denis, where were you when you heard the news?
I was actually out of the country.
Okay.
I heard driving through South London on it must have been a Sunday afternoon, I think. In 1974, I was out of the country for his entire prime ministership, which might make you think that I'm not qualified to write about it. But, as the years have gone by, I've come to think more and more about Norman Kirk and what he stood for, and those thoughts culminated in this book.
In that period of his prime ministership, as you say, less than 2 years, he certainly achieved a lot and had a political ethos, which personally I think makes him unique in terms of prime ministers of New Zealand. How would you sum up Norman Kirk and the things that he stood for?
The word humanitarian comes to mind, or humane, or even just plain old human. More than most leaders, perhaps more than any other we've had, he wore his heart on his sleeve.
Yeah.
He was a big man, as you say, not just physically, but he had a big heart, a big compassion, a big feeling, especially for ordinary people. And people picked up on that. He wasn't just some remote technocrat or political manager like so many prime ministers turn out to be.
Yep.
He was someone who'd been born and brought up in the working class. He knew poverty. He knew hard labour. He worked in labouring jobs for most of his life before entering Parliament. He was a man of the people, almost literally. That sounds like a cliche.
Yeah,
but he was, and maybe that's why he came to be so loved.
Unfortunately, no longer a cliche. I mean, most politicians have either done political science degrees or ex-lawyers rather than the broad spectrum of society. There's that wonderful quote from him about how New Zealand citizens can expect to have somebody to love, somewhere to live, somewhere to work, and something to hope for. And from his, I suppose, aspirational goals, this is something that he believed the government should support and help people to achieve.
Yes, it's the absolute basics, if you like, of what politics should be, looking after people, but not to the point where you squash them.
Yep.
You give them and help them to get what they basically need in life, and they can take it from there. Interestingly, Jacinda Ardern used to quote that as well. She was very inspired by Kirk herself. It's not an original quote, by the way. It goes back a couple of hundred years. I think other politicians have used it in various forms. But interestingly, Kirk used it to mean, yes, that's the basics. That's what we should all have. But let's not get too greedy. Let's not go too far beyond that. He felt New Zealanders were in risk of becoming too materialistic, too keen on getting that second or third car. In his age, the colour TV was just coming in. Yeah. All these lovely things, beautiful, nice to have. But he came to feel that we should be satisfied with less.
Perhaps a bit of a prophetic statement there from Norm as well in terms of the sort of country that would become, and even future Labour governments, the different ideology that was introduced. I suppose when you look at Norman Kirk in contrast to some of what has followed and even some of what we can see today, quite a distinctive difference in terms of his political ideology and his motivations.
Yes. So when I call my book We Need to Talk About Norman. In many ways, that's code for we need to talk about different ways of government and look back at how we were governed then and take the good from it. Not all of it was wonderful. It certainly wasn't wonderful for women and Maori and gays in those days.
Yeah.
But there were many good things about what we used to call social democracy. Government was much more hands-on. It had a moral purpose. It stood for the public good. But now, and I think you're clicking into this, we have much more technocratic governments.
Yes.
Much more remote, much more bureaucratic, much more doing things by the book, spending endless money on consultants to find out what they think. It's getting rarer, isn't it, for politicians to take a moral stand on anything.
Yeah.
They can't seem to take a step without seeking advice from consultants and other people and calling for an inquiry or a report. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And
lost that. Kirk just said, look, if there's a problem, let's go to it, fix it, do it.
Yeah. And perhaps in some ways those were simpler days. Do you think, I mean, I suppose part of the purpose of the book is to, yes, recognise the legacy of Norman Kirk and perhaps ask the question, could we go back there? He seems to be the sort of politician that a lot of people might vote for if he was running in the upcoming election. But have things changed too much, do you think, Denis? Can we go back, or is there too much vested interest in politics now with particularly big business and lobby groups, etc.? Could we go back to the more simple days of Norman Kirk?
I guess not, because so much has happened, especially in terms of globalization and the spread of neoliberal ideology. And New Zealand's a small country. We can only do so much for ourselves. And even Kirk might not have been able to withstand all of that. But I think there are some specific things we could do. One of the things I feel strongly about, and I know Kirk did, is protecting local manufacturing and industry.
Yeah.
It breaks my heart to see how much we get done offshore now, and when we could have it done here. The example of the Dunedin rail workshop comes to mind, when the government chose to have all its wagons made in China because it was cheaper. Mm-hmm. And now just recently, I think a week or two ago, when the Ministry of Education chose to have wool carpet tiles made in the United States to the rage of local sheep farmers who feel their wool is perfectly good for that kind of thing. But that's globalization. You now go where what's cheaper. But I think, in fact, if you're prepared to pay a little more, you should be taking more protection of New Zealand's own workforce.
Ultimately, politics is about looking after the people and giving them the opportunity to thrive in their own country. Certainly some lessons we can learn from Norman Kirk. I would thoroughly recommend this book, especially as people are making hopefully thoughtful decisions about who to vote for and thinking more about politics as we head towards the election. The book is called We Need to Talk About Norman by Denis Welch. Denis, thank you for writing the book. Where can people get a copy?
It's I've seen it in Whitcoulls here in Wellington, and I know Whitcoulls have copies throughout their shops, throughout the country, and all their shops, plus the shops like Unity and in Wellington and Auckland and Time Out in Auckland. It's available right around the country, thanks to my publisher, Quentin Wilson.
Well, it is a wonderful book. I do personally recommend it. Again, thank you for taking the time to raise this important issue from the obscurity of history and talk about some of the lessons that we can apply to today. Denis, kia ora, thank you for your time today.
Many thanks. Thank you, Andrew.